We left last week with Deakin's much anticipated return to the head office. Having voluntarily ceded control to Labor and then stabbing them in the back to support George Reed's Free Traders, he brought Labor back on side to then backstab Reed. But after just a year in office, Deakin had to face off against Reed in the 1906 election. This time, Reed had rebranded his Free Trader Party to become the Anti-Socialist Party, and he went hard on the attack. Having stabbed Watson in the back and having stabbed Reed in the back, what was to stop Deakin stabbing capitalist Australia in the back? The results came in and Deakin retained the office of Prime Minister, but it wasn't good news for him. His constant flipping had cost the Protectionists 10 seats in Parliament, and the Labor Protectionist coalition was completely imbalanced. The Protectionists held 16 seats to Labor's 26. Deakin wasn't just leading a minority government, he was a minority within the minority government. Okay, so this episode is a tasty one, and you might actually notice some similar themes to last week. Make sure to hang around until the end to take part in this week's subscriber question as well. But before we get to the backstabbing, we probably should talk policy, because Deakin's second stint as Prime Minister actually saw Australia make some strides away from the British. Essentially, the two had different perspectives on what to do with Japan. For the British, they'd played a huge role in the Meiji Restoration and helped Japan to industrialise, and they were important naval allies. But if you know your Japanese history, you'd know that 1905 was a huge year for Nippon because it was the first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European nation when Japan beat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. For Deakin, he was pretty concerned by this because a strong Japanese naval presence was now a new security issue in the Pacific. As a result, Deakin took keen interest in British New Guinea, the southeastern quarter of what's today called Papua New Guinea. Queensland had previously tried to annex it in 1883, but the British had denied them. However, in 1902, Britain ceded the territory over to Australia, and in 1905, the Deakin government passed the Papua Act to begin the process of Australian administration. Then, in 1907, Deakin wanted Australia to have a more decisive voice on foreign policy at Britain's Imperial Conference, but he was largely rebuffed.
How come I never get any lines in these things?
Shut up, Meg.
In response, Deakin started to assert something of Australian independence as he reached out to none other than Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt allowed the American Great White Fleet to visit Australia in 1908, and they were greeted by 500,000 Australians in Sydney, the largest gathering of Australians up until this point. With all this fanfare, Deakin had the public support in commissioning an Australian Navy, and preparation began with compulsory military training also being introduced. By making his request directly to American diplomats rather than through the imperial authorities, Deakin had defied protocol, but this would be crucial for Australian independence from the motherland. With Deakin so deeply in the pockets of Labor, he set up an arbitration court to determine a fair wage, and the system would go something like this. If the court found your business paid your workers a quote-unquote fair wage, well then the business would be exempt from the domestic tariffs that protectionists were known for putting on businesses. As a result, with no one having to pay those extra taxes to buy your product, they would be incentivized to buy from you. And so this new court delivered its famous Harvester judgment, where it defined what this fair wage was to be. Now, it didn't put a number on it, but instead said that a living wage had to be able to support a wife and 3 children in frugal comfort, while a skilled worker should receive an extra margin for their skills, and this is the key bit, that extra margin should be regardless of the employer's capacity to pay. And so minimum wages were not to be set through the free market like in America, but by an external arbitrator. Australia was well and truly living up to its status as the working man's paradise. In 1908, the Deakin government added an old age pension, and then construction began on an east to west transcontinental railway, but Deakin himself was to be railroaded. Like I said before, in Deakin's coalition government, Labor held the balance of power 26 seats to 16. And so after being egged on by his Labor members, their new leader, Andrew Fisher, decided to remove support for the Protectionists, going solo to form their own government.
Do it.
Okay, so Fisher has quite an interesting backstory. He was a classic unionist, but actually rose through the ranks in quite tragic circumstances. His father suffered debilitating injuries in Scottish coal mines in the 1800s, and so just a boy, Fisher put himself into those same mines to feed his family. What was also interesting was that in 1899 the Boer War broke out in South Africa between the British Empire and the Dutch-based Boer republics. Australia wasn't federated at this point, but each of the 6 colonies independently supported the war. However, Fisher, now a member of the Queensland Parliament, vehemently opposed it, which put him on the map. Essentially, after the 1906 election which saw Deakin's protectionists crippled, Labor's leader, Chris Watson, stepped down. Leadership was then contested between two people. Obviously Fisher, who'd moved from the Queensland Parliament to the Federal Parliament, but then someone else who will pan out to be way more important in future episodes, Billy Hughes. Now, Fisher edged out Hughes and his government passed some minor reforms. Firstly, they passed a new Seat of Government Act which overturned George Reed's Act that had established Dalgety as the nation's capital. A new federal capital was to be built in the Yass-Canberra area. Secondly, Fisher's government passed the Manufacturers Encouragement Act to provide bounties for iron and steel manufacturers who paid fair and reasonable wages to their workers. Okay, that was such a selfish cutaway. Like the video if you want more LEGO Star Wars cutaways that remind you of a time in life where your biggest worry was whether or not you'd pack Benji and your Atomic Tomato Sandboys. Anyway, back to Fisher. He carried on with Deakin's naval building plans by expanding the Australian fleet with 3 more destroyers. However, his betrayal of Deakin completely ruined their friendship, and as with Fisher's predecessor, Chris Watson, Deakin was out for blood, whatever the cost. In a meeting in Melbourne's Parliament House, Deakin met with the new leader of the Anti-Socialist Party, Joseph Cook. Now remember, the Anti-Socialists were formerly known as the Free Traders, and Deakin had temporarily sided with the Free Traders as we saw last week, but that was just to teach Labor a lesson and put them in their place. But Deakin's new idea was outrageous. If the Protectionists and Anti-Socialists merged their parties together, not as a coalition of 2 parties but as a singular party, they would have the numbers to snatch government away from Labor. Just let that sink in. Deakin proposed the Protectionists and what used to be the Free Traders merge into one party. Like I said last time, just imagine the Australian Progressive Party and the Australian Conservative Party merging. They're by definition complete opposites. Cook was on board with this, and the two officially merged to become the Fusion Party. Now, obviously this incensed some Protectionist MPs, as the very principle that they stood for was sold out, and so they defected to Labor. When this was announced before Parliament, the usually non-partisan Speaker of the House, Sir Frederick Holder, shouted, "Terrible, terrible." William Lyne, whom you might remember for trying to snake Edmund Barton out of leadership, called Deakin Judas. But regardless of the jeers in Parliament, in 1909 for a third time, Deakin was back. But Deakin had to make quick work because an election was around the corner in 1910 and Fisher wanted his revenge. Strangely, Deakin's physical and mental prowess was on the decline, and he really struggled with memory. So going into the election, things looked grim. Deakin was seen not only as a backstabber, but also as a Joe Biden-like gaff machine.
Hey everyone, I'm Joe Biden's husband.
So Deakin needed a PR win. He couldn't go into the election as the Fusion Party because that word reminded the public of Deakin's deal with Cook. Instead, Deakin's party would go by the name of something else.
The Liberal Government!
Well, kind of. Deakin's Liberal Party wasn't the same as the one we see today. That one was launched by Menzies after World War II, but nonetheless the foundations for the modern Liberal Party were in place. And going into 1910, for the first time in our history, Australia was preparing for a Liberal-Labor showdown. Thanks for watching. Your job's not done here though. Let me know below who you think wins the 1910 election. Honor rules, no Googling. Everyone who's correct gets a shout out next week next to a piece of nostalgic Australiana, so make sure to comment below. Next episode, we see what happened in this election and see the build up to Australia's baptism of fire, Gallipoli. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.